Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. Information and communication technologies play an important role in promoting sustainable development. This has been a driving force behind the United Nations University's mission here in Macau. The university's International Institute for Software Technology was established in Macau in 1989 as an organ of the United Nations and a research and training center. It has meanwhile been renamed Institute on Computing and Society, and the Institute's director, Michael Best, is joining us for tonight's talk show. Michael Best, welcome to the show. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You've been based in Macau for about 3 years, and you had a very important mission, I believe, to relaunch the United Nations University. Tell us about what's been going on over the last couple of years.
Absolutely. Well, when I arrived about 3 years ago, there was myself and one other employee based in our campus building on Gia Hill. Since then, we've built a small team of international researchers with a mandate to explore the role of computer and communication technologies in international development. Specifically, we're looking at the role of high-impact information and communication innovations on developing societies.
And what's in it when it comes to the name change? I mean, Institute for Software Technology, International Institute for Software Technology, and now something simpler, which is Institute on Computing and Society. Is it the same, in other words, or does it imply a slightly different mission, or?
I think there has been a change in the mission insofar as the original institute really focused more on engineering aspects of software technologies and systems, whereas the goal of the new institute is much more trying to align the work of the institute researchers with the overall UN mandate of sustainable development.
Over the years, perhaps because of different periods, the United Nations University has not been the limelight, and to some it has been keeping a relatively low-key stance and approach. Is that the case? Why have we got this kind of impression?
Well, because I think it's an accurate impression, to be perfectly candid with you. We have not succeeded in outreaching to the city to the degree we would like to. And part of my job as the director is to ensure that we do a better job of reaching out to the city, both the people on the street, the average person in Macau, as well as to some of our partner institutions. And so I can give you some examples of things we're trying to do. We've recently launched a new engagement with City University here in Macau, exploring ways in which data analytics and big data might go towards problems of social science and humanities. We've had a long-standing relationship with the University of Macau, trying to work with their computer and social scientists, and then some continued work with different aspects of the government here in Macau. So we're trying, but we really want to do a better job. We want to invite the city to our facilities, and towards that end, we're actually hope to break ground on a renovation of the building. This might actually start within a month, fingers crossed. And the aim of that renovation includes turning the ground floor of our facility into more of a public space with a small event hall and a gallery. And part of the purpose of really making the ground floor friendly to the community is to allow us to host more programming that would be of interest to just the general population here in Macau.
I'm sure many of our viewers have passed by the facility. It's a charming, old-style villa, Casa Silva Mendes. Yep. There's a need for some renovation, right?
Yep.
How long would that take? And I guess you've been also having to face some hurdles in that process, of course. In Macau, things take some time.
Yeah, though I'll be perfectly frank with you, the major delays have been from the United Nations side, not the city,
okay.
Side. So I actually have to thank the city of Macau for being relatively speedy compared to the bureaucracies of the United Nations. It's true, the Casa de Silva Mendes, the building that we occupy, is really lovely, and many people walk past it. It's just underneath the lighthouse there on Gia Hill, but people don't know what it is. I've had local people walk up to me and ask me when the church is going to be open, thinking that we're actually some sort of religious church rather than being a research institute. The building was built in 1905 for Manuel de Silva Mendes, who I gather was a Portuguese settler. He was a lawyer, judge, an art collector, a political philosopher, and somebody who...
A remarkable citizen.
Sounded like it.
Yes. But of course, you've been, in a way, allow me to say, preaching, figuratively speaking, of course, this link between ICT, information and communication technologies, and sustainable development to meet the goals put forth by the United Nations. Tell us about a couple of flagship projects running and being managed, or where the United Nations Universities Institute is involved in.
Right. We have 4 main project areas. One focuses on the role of women in digital technologies, and in that project we're examining women and girls' leadership, skills, and training in computer and communication areas. That's a global partnership where Macau is one member of this global partnership, but we at UNUCS, at the Computing and Society Institute, focus as the research lead for this global partnership. Another area of work we're undertaking is in data for sustainable development tracking and monitoring. And this particular line of inquiry looks at local or grassroots data and the way in which we might use data to examine various aspects of sustainable development, like labor and income, economic development, cultural issues, environmental issues, and so forth. A broad range of sustainable development issues. And we're focused on the data side, data acquisition and analysis. A third area we're looking at is the role of computer and communication technologies, in particular mobile telephony for migrants. And this project has looked, for instance, at the role of labor migration into the city of Macau itself, and how folks who come from very far away in mainland China or perhaps from Southeast Asia use things like WeChat to coordinate amongst themselves, to stay connected with their family and friends, and to even make business decisions as they relate to the organizations that often act as an intermediary to their employer here in the city.
And let me jump in here, because I'm sure this is of interest of many of our viewers, this project on migrant workers and technology. What's the current state or status in terms of the research project? Have we got any preliminary findings? Have you been engaging with the local communities, associations, etc.?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, the general answer to what is the stage of the research is early, because even though we started, relaunched the Institute in 2015, 3 years ago, it really took us a year to get staffed and going. And so the oldest project is a year or two old, and on the timeline associated with research, that means we're in our infancy. So all of our work is fairly early. That said, we do have some really, I think, nice initial results. Looking at labor migration. For instance, we've looked at the way in which people who are what's called dual migrants, these are folks coming from mainland China and then living in Zhuhai and day migrating across the border into Macau to do construction work, for instance, we've been looking at the ways in which they've been using mobile phone chat facilities to know when to show up, where, how to keep coordinated with their work, and again, how to reach their family and friends, often at great distances in other locations within China. So we've seen a variety of different ways in which these technologies really have been central to these migrants here in the city and in the general Pearl River Delta region, and in particular central to both their day-to-day work world and them being able to keep a sense of their family, friends, and home while still being able to work quite often at quite some physical distance.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a fourth project, right?
Yes, absolutely, and that's in our Digital Peace Lab. This is an area where we're looking at the role of information and communication technologies in peace and security, with a particular focus on the UN Blue Helmet peacekeeping forces. These forces are mostly on the African continent right now, and so this work has a tendency to target African peacekeeping missions. I will note, however, that China is one of the major troop contributing countries right now, especially contributing very skilled, uniform individuals into UN peacekeeping missions. For instance, I've been to many missions where all the medical staff are Chinese nationals. So there is quite a Chinese presence in these UN peacekeeping missions. Our overall goal with this project is to examine computer and communication innovation within I'll be honest, a very difficult context. In conflict-stressed environments, in UN missions that often are not really free to move around a community because of security threats, and often are off infrastructure and the traditional grids, so might exist in areas with no electric power facilities or telecommunications infrastructure, something very different than day-to-day life here in Macau. But nevertheless, the importance of the work that these peacekeepers are doing is really stunning, and the fact that they're able to manage their mission in these very difficult settings, I think, speaks to the hard efforts of these individual peacekeepers.
So these research projects, of course, surely entail a great deal of coordination, having Macau playing and the Institute, I understand, playing a pivotal role. But then, let's say in terms of field work, for instance, in those peacekeeping missions spread throughout the world, how do you coordinate that with the field work, with those on the ground, and also in terms of partner institutions doing this work? In addition to your institute, who else is involved in the projects?
Yeah, so there's a different set of partners for each of these four project areas I've described, and coordination is a huge part of our job, and I think in particular my job.
Sure.
I spent a lot of time on the coordination and kind of networking side of the work. So in the case of the peacekeeping project, our main partner is the UN Peacekeeping Organization, and they're based in New York City, but because the missions are scattered across primarily the African continent, it means getting on planes often enough and traveling to these African nations to coordinate and collaborate with our partners there. In other projects, we have different sets of partners. So in the Migrant Technology Project, we have partners, of course, here in Macau. It includes Caritas, which is a very large civil society organization that works...
One of the top charities in town.
One of the top charities. And we've had a very close collaboration with them, looking at things as it relates to migrants in different conditions within the city. That doesn't require quite as much air travel to deal with,
That's right.
to get with Caritas in Macau, as opposed to a African peacekeeping mission. In the gender technology space, this project is a global partnership. It's called Equals, is the name of the partnership, and this is a very large collaboration amongst, in particular, 4 or so founding organizations: UNU, Computing Society in Macau, the International Telecommunications Union, which is a UN agency headquartered in Geneva, the International Trade Commission, which is another UN agency headquartered in Geneva, UN Women, which is yet another UN agency, in this case headquartered in New York City, and the GSMA Association, which is a corporate union of almost every major mobile phone operator, and they happen to be headquartered in London. But you can imagine, let's just say that I spend a lot of my time late in the night or early in the morning on conference calls.
Of course, because of
the time
difference,
zones.
of course.
When especially it includes North America, Europe, and us here in Macau. Generally, it means I'm up late at night.
Sure. And this leads me to the question, so what is Macau's added value? I mean, being based in Macau, why why establishing this institute in the first place? That was back in 1989, throughout 1980s. Why keeping it, and what is the added value or the role of having this based in the Macau SAR?
Well, the why in Macau historically goes back to when Portugal returned the city to China under the one country, two system policy. And it was, I think, really a genius move on the part of Lisbon, Beijing, and the city of Macau to try to negotiate with the United Nations to stand up a presence in the city, essentially as a lasting gift to the world under the decolonialization as Portugal withdrew from the city. So it really was a generous and delightful policy decision that those three state actors made. Going back to the 80s, I think, is when the negotiations started. They then created some financial resources for the UNU to have a Macau presence, and the city in particular has provided the physical location, this villa that we've discussed. The question as to why stay, besides the fact that the generosity of these three capitals, so to speak, and in particular the city and the physical location, is right now the Pearl River Delta is the most interesting place in the world for computing. I mean, it just is. And Macau is this, in some ways, small, right? It feels, normally you don't think of a city, I don't think normally of a city of the size of Macau as small, but in the context of our neighbors, it's pretty small. Macau is this small, very unique city amongst this incredible set of computing powerhouses. Really, there's no place like this in the world right now. So in that sense, there's not a better part of the world to have a UN institute focused on computing and society.
And this leads me to the question of your links with cities and institutes and institutions across the border in the Pearl River Delta region, and now, shall we say, the Greater Bay Area. Yeah. What's been done so far? Could we expect any new partnerships?
I sure hope so. And this goes back to sort of when you asked me about our relationships in the city. It is a work in progress. We're never going to be done, but we are always working to engage with our neighbors outside even of the city boundary itself and going into the region. So Shenzhen's an obvious
place. So Shenzhen is taking the lead, right?
It is.
Internationally, we can say that, not only in the Asia-Pacific region, right?
Shenzhen is, of course, Asia's Silicon Valley, but internationally, it's Asia's go-to place for manufacturing and sourcing of components for almost everything that we use these days that's digital.
Because it's got the different parts of the value chain process just in a matter of, I don't know, 10 to 15 kilometers distance. You can have the the two sides of the whole process. Right?
Yeah.
It's from design to production and then testing. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as from, the electronic component markets, which I just find stunning. And as a computer guy, it's just like a Christmas time or a play pen, just to go to those amazing component markets that just go on for kilometers and kilometers. From that end of things to major multinationals doing significant design, research, and assembly, Dell Computing, for instance, to Huawei and Tencent and ZTE and all the major Chinese companies, some of which are headquartered, of course, there in Shenzhen, and almost all of the majors have some significant presence. So that's exactly where it goes from design to manufacturing to delivery of things. And one other thing I would add is university presence, which is interesting and growing space in Shenzhen as many universities begin to create satellite campuses there in the city because the local ICT computing sector needs talent, and they want to be able to source talent who have gone through top training programs from many universities. So many of them are there in Shenzhen now.
There's a lot of talk now about artificial intelligence. Actually, it's ranking pretty high on mainland China's agenda, and the country's agenda, I shall say. China is aiming at becoming the world's top player in this field. Would that be also part of your field in the future of research, or would you meet, would that be like ICT and AI naturally, coming together?
Yeah, we do currently have a modest program in exploring AI, societal impacts of AI, and AI and in peace and security. It's quite modest because I'm the main person driving it, and let's just say that I don't always put in enough time to this project. It's a project, though, that we're doing in collaboration with the ITU, that's the Geneva-based UN organization I already mentioned, and Harvard University in the United States, which has a large programming in internet and society. So we have some AI programming going on right now. How much that will grow, I'm not sure, but I know that it would be exciting if we did grow it, both because of the reasons that you said, which is that China is a powerhouse already and aims to become really the world dominant player in this space, but also because one of the areas that I think we add value is we always ask the engineers, the computer scientists, what is the impact and what are the issues for people, for humanity, for society. And sometimes computer engineers forget to ask those questions, and they go off and build things because it's fun to build things without thinking through all the consequences. And part of our job is to slowly interrogate these new engineering areas as to how they might impact us as humans on this planet. And AI, like any other technology, has multiple valences. There are good things about it and there are bad things about it, and we have to think about that ahead of time.
Well, those who cast a skeptical eye on all these developments related to big data and artificial intelligence are particularly worried on the impact this will have on personal data privacy, on individual freedoms, saying something like big data plus artificial intelligence equals Big Brother. What's your take on this debate?
I think it's a totally valid concern. I'm concerned because we know that big data is basically lots of personal data, often. When, in fact, most of the time when people say big data, they're generally talking about data about us. And it's a lot of personal data. And being able to have more sophistication in the way we analyze that data absolutely can have benefit. But in the wrong hands or applied in the wrong ways can absolutely have negative outcomes. It's exactly what I was calling a dual valence. It's sort of good things and bad things. What needs to happen is that we as a community that includes engineers, policymakers, social scientists, and just, you know, people in the world on the streets, you know, the men and women of Macau need to weigh in on ensuring that we have appropriate protections, in this case around privacy.
And this also is somehow related to the issue of education, digital literacy. So people will learn ways to protect themselves from all these risks associated with extensive use of big data or artificial intelligence by state or non-state entities who could pose a risk to one's freedoms and privacy.
I think so, for sure. And I'm stunned as a professor with young students at the lack of literacy, even amongst computer students, technical students, let alone anyone else, who have no appreciation of what they're sharing and with whom. Don't understand that every time they go on to some online social media platform and provide pictures or details of their day-to-day activity.
Digital footprint is pretty much all over the place, right?
Right, but it's in some ways frightening, and we need to teach, just as you say, this kind of digital literacy, that people are aware of what they're sharing and what are the impacts of that sharing, who's acquiring the data, and for what purpose they might apply it.
So this is also related to the issue of professional ethics by those engineers, professionals, and policymakers who are involved in all these large-scale endeavor. Do you think it's doable to promote and raise awareness, ethics, when it comes to this?
I think so, though I don't think that it's just a matter in that case of getting the word out. And if only we tell everybody, don't build a horrible, evil AI, that it'll just...
There must be regulation, right?
I think so. That's exactly where I was going. There needs to be some sort of policy interventions as well.
Before we wrap up our talk, I'd like to talk about, and since we've mentioned literacy, the so-called digital divide or gap, because perhaps a number of developing or underdeveloped countries are gradually catching up, but we still do witness this divide. And this is a key thing for your institute and for the United Nations University. But from what you've seen, what you've observed, what you've studied, is it narrowing the gap?
Yes and no. So definitely if the digital divide is a measure of access to devices and infrastructure, that gap...
it is narrowing, right?
That gap is narrowing. If the digital divide is a measure of purposeful and impactful use of technology, it's a little bit of a plus and minus situation. So we see places where more people are using technologies, but not in ways that we can demonstrate value as it relates to, say, economic growth or something like that. So at UNUCS, we look at these technologies not as means of themselves, not as goals in and of themselves, but as means to some particular end. So it's not just enough to make sure everyone has a handset in their pocket that's data enabled. What needs to happen is that that mobile phone in everyone's pocket with data network connectivity has to have add some value to these people in ways that's truly meaningful to them. And that gap, the value gap, it's a mixed bag. Some places benefit outweighs detriment, but not in every place and not in every case.
Is there a need for a kind of governance mechanism at the United Nations level to be taken to a higher level in order to tackle the issue of the north-south, not only necessarily north-south, but in a digital divide, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, those risks associated with wrongful use of big data and artificial intelligence.
So you've stepped into a very controversial area
Yes.
right now in terms of the stakeholder conversation. The idea of United Nations governance within computing and the internet is controversial.
To say the least.
To say the least.
Yes.
I personally I'm not sure, even. And I definitely do not think that the UN should be running the internet as an extreme way to kind of cartoon what UN governance might look like. How the UN could be a vigorous participant in global governance of the internet is a real contested area that's been under discussion for probably a decade now. No clear resolution right now. We'll see.
We'll see. And now one final question. Where we began, which was, of course, talking about the Institute on Computing and Society. The next step, you have these 4 projects that you singled out. What is likely to take place in the coming couple of years that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I can definitely tell you for 2018, we are keeping these 4 projects and growing them within their scale and scope. We don't currently have an additional project that we're incubating beyond things like the AI, the modest AI project and that kind of stuff. But in terms of our flagship or tentpole projects, these 4 really, I think, will be the core activities for 2018. The things that I think will really be new goes to this question you raised about our outreach. In 2018, if the renovation goes as hoped, you will see a lot more about us in terms of citywide activities, region-wide activities, and so we're going to put a lot of our time and attention not just in these 4 main research areas, but in being a good citizen and a good neighbor. That's really a 2018 goal, at least that I hold very dear.
And we will be taking note of that and keeping a close eye on it on TDM. Thank you very much, Michael Best, for joining us. Pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. And to you at home, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week.